So, whether you love it or hate it, the single biggest thing to happen in the Tolkien community last year was the premiere of Rings of Power. I, for one, really enjoyed it. It wasn't perfect and a bit rough in places, but overall I felt it was a welcome blast of fresh air, and I can't wait to see more of it. And while some people did have valid criticisms, other people were more...
I can't believe you want to watch this show. You know they just did a 3-episode arc where beats using nothing but her Mary Sue powers?
Are you sure you haven't seen the show?
Yeah, cause I'm not a 12-year-old girl. Also, dude, why would I watch a show that's set in but
You watched
because it wasn't a fucking tsunami of virtue signaling.
But regardless of all that, one of my favorite parts was the depiction of Numenor, as I feel like it really captures the spirit of the setting from the books while expanding and building on the themes and stories therein. Also, it just looks really cool. This all led me to build myself a set of Numenorean warriors based directly on the show design, using a pile of historical miniature sets. They're not 100% on model, but I was super happy with how they turned out. But having seen the show now, there are several things that I feel are missing, namely the cavalry. Getting back to the lore, there are some questions as to whether or not Numenoreans really use cavalry, but we'll get to that later. For now, we started by figuring out what miniatures to use as the basis for these figures, and there were some obvious contenders. The main kit I used for the infantry were the Fireforged Byzantine Spearmen, so I started by looking through the rest of Fireforge's catalog. They actually have 3 different options for Byzantine cavalry, the first being the Byzantine horse archers, and right off the bat, these ones weren't going to work. The main issue was that these didn't have the scale mail armor that was the main element that tied them to the Numenoreans. Also, another element in the Rings of Power design I wanted to bring in was the bits of armor on the horses themselves. So based on that, let's take a look at the Byzantine cataphracts. And again, these don't really hit it. While the riders work better having pleated armor that matches up well enough to the troops, the horses just didn't really work. This time they were too heavily armored, as the show's horses only have armor around the head and neck, rather than the long barding that these ones have. So finally, let's take a look at the Byzantine Kursorovs, which seem to be a middle ground between the two, with the properly styled torsos and semi-armored horses. So after staring at pics of the sprues for ages, I finally bit the billet and ordered them, which is where the build begins. The kit itself is pretty great, with tons of options and extras that make it perfect for kit bashing. The biggest element though is the horse armor, as it not only has options for either bare or armored heads, the barding is actually made up of separate pieces in the same way that new plastic armor was from Games Workshop. So I built up a set of horses using the armored heads while leaving the bodies bare, before then clipping out the legs and body of the rider and attaching them too, as they'll work perfectly as is. This brings us on to the next kit, as I don't want the perigas, I think they're called, that they have on their arms, and instead wanted the scaled pattern to carry over. So I grabbed another Fireforge kit, this time the Foot Sergeant, which is another fantastic kit for kit bashing. In this case, I really wanted the pleated sleeves that they have, as I ran out of the bits from the Arab cavalry that I used on the infantry, and I felt these would match up relatively well. However, I did want to use the lances from the knights, and so took the sergeant arms and sliced them under the sleeve before doing the same to the Byzantine lance arms and gluing them together. Then I just attached these onto the main body, along with a suitable left arm from the Foot Sergeant kit to match up. Next I needed shields, so I once again turned to the Gripping Beast Arabs, this time pulling from the infantry rather than the cavalry, as I had already used most of the cavalry shields. This was actually interesting, as I had some fun deciding where to attach these onto the figure, as I often feel that shields cover up a bit too much of the model for my liking when they're just attached onto the arms. Also, the cavalry in the show don't seem to have shields, so by making these less central to the figure, it once again tied them in nicely to the show. So I spent some time chatting with my patrons about where the shields looked best and ended up mixing them up between the models, with some sitting on the back like here and some on their horses' haunches. Next we needed heads, and I basically had to use more of the Gripping Beast Saxon heads to make sure they matched up, but I actually ran out of those bits too. So I ended up scavenging some from the 2 test figures I did last time, attaching them to their new bodies with a bit of super glue and green stuff as the neck connectors didn't match up. I also took some heads off of another kit to make some female Numenorean knights, but we're going to talk more about them in another video. Then I went a bit extra by adding a banner onto one of them by supergluing some packaging paper onto the lance before bending it into shape and solidifying it with a couple of layers of Mod Podge. Then I added some pendants using the same techniques onto the lances of the other 2 cavalry troops, as you once again can see these in the show. And with that, the basic cavalry is done, so let's take a moment to discuss the role of horses in Numenor, as one question that gets asked a lot is, did Numenor even have cavalry? The initial answer may appear to be no, as in the Unfinished Tales it states the Numenorians in their own land possessed horses, but they did not use them in war. However, it does go on to explain that this is because all of their wars were overseas, which the battles in the show are. Also, it says Otar, warrior soldier, was the title of all who, though fully trained and experienced, had not yet been admitted to the rank of Rokin, or knight, with Quen being a term defined further in War of the Jewels as Rokin, horseman, rider. So does this imply that Numenoreans did have cavalry as part of their armies? But the inconsistencies in the writing does make it look like maybe Tolkien made some mistakes here. Or is this an example of the inevitable inconsistencies that occur when almost 90% of what we consider Tolkien's writing is actually posthumous publications by his son based on rough drafts of his father's work? So maybe we shouldn't get so worked up about every little detail and inaccuracy, but I don't know. Maybe just something to think about. And obviously I did all this research myself and didn't just look at a Reddit post that came up as the first result on Google when you search Numenorean Cavalry. That would be cheating. Moving on, I then filled out the ranks by making a captain to match my foot one using the same head and crest I used before, as well as a cape from the Frostgrave Soldiers 2 set. Since the last video, I also mocked up a quick little version of Elendil on foot, and so decided to make a mounted version of him here too, which started in the same way as the rest, which I then differentiated with some more heavily armored arms stolen from an old warrior of Minas Tirith, as well as a head from the Gripping Beast late Romans, which I attached a set of Fountain Court Guard wing crests onto. Honestly, I'm not 100% happy with this, as it doesn't look as good as the foot version, but it does look a lot better painted up, so I stuck it out. Also, I opted to leave him with a sword, which I stole from the Gripping Beast Saxons rather than the lance, to better match up with his MESBG profile. Finally, I also made a version of Queen Regent Muriel, with her extra mail and wild helmet. But like the female knight from before, we'll talk more about her in an aforementioned future video. So all that's left now is to paint these up, and we've already seen this before. Basically, I painted these up in the same way as all of my Numenorean troops, so let's go check out that video, with the only extra bit here being carrying over the colors onto the horse's tack, and painting up some of the extra bits on the new heroes like Elendil with his feathery hat, which was just a couple of layers of red with off-white mixed in. The only real different thing I did here was to try and use exclusively contrast paint to do the horses themselves, which I've tried out in the past on my Start Cavalry from the Song of Ice and Fire game. Which is a great game, by the way, and I would love to do some videos specifically about that if people are interested in it. I want to try it again here, as the gradient we got from the Zenithal Prime should lend itself really nicely to this kind of painting. Basically, I just thinned out different colors about 50-50 with contrast medium and laid them straight on, which worked really well, especially when going back with some extra medium to thin it down even more on the raised sections. Then it was just on to basing them like the rest of the army, and there you go. I love them. I already really liked the stark, clean colors of the Numenoreans I had already done, but I feel like they stand out even better on the cavalry, making these some of my favorite models I have. And while like the troops, they may not 100% match the show versions, I do feel like they match up well enough to be obviously recognizable while still different enough to feel truly unique. So for now, thank you all so much for watching, as all of you do so much to support me, like the dimensionally transcendent Numenorean ships sailing with a full load of troops, horses, and dreams. See, I can poke fun at it too. In particular, thank you so much to all of my patrons for their ever-patient support, and be sure to do all of those good things with the subs, notifications, and likes, but above all else, stay safe and happy out there. I'm Anders, and have a good one all.